Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm going to be speaking about a topic that relates very much to things that are happening in the news. In fact, anytime I speak about Israel, I'm speaking about what's happening in the news. Because it's important to always remember that Israel is central to what is happening in the United States. It's central to what is happening in Washington. It's central to what is happening in Eastern Europe, and it's central to what is happening in the world. I said Jerusalem is the center of the world. Now yes, I know this little tiny speck on the map. It's hard to understand that this little tiny speck on the map can be the center of the world. But it is, because God said so. Now if you believe that the Torah, that the Bible is some sort of primitive piece of work that isn't relevant to our times, so okay, you think that everything I'm saying is nonsense. But if you understand the centrality of Israel, the reality of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that there is nothing normal in the modern sense. There is nothing normal about a people that is sovereign in a land for over 1,000 years and then is exiled from that land for 2,000 years and is scattered around the world for those 2,000 years and is persecuted and is slaughtered by the millions during those 2,000 years, and yet is very extremely successful in many places during those 2,000 years. And then comes back into its own land, where it was once sovereign, and retakes the country and builds up the country and turns it into a world power. Doesn't make sense. I forgot to mention something about all that. That in addition to all those historical facts that I just mentioned, every single thing that I mentioned just now is written about in prophecy, in biblical prophecy. And it all came true. And that is my response to the atheists. Okay, and I don't have that many opportunities to speak directly to groups of atheists, although I do appear in the media quite often, so I'm sure there are some atheists who listen, just happen to be listening. But it's important to understand that about Israel. About Israel and about the Jewish people. So I'm going to be speaking mainly about the Jewish people. And I'll also talk about Israel. I'll also talk about who I am and where I come from, and where I've been. Well, I was watching on the American news the hearings in Washington. And I was watching the Judiciary Committee, and I saw some of the tough questioning of the Supreme Court, now Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And the questioning was being carried out in a very, very harsh, critical way, which I thought was unfair, but you don't have to agree with me, by Senators Feinstein, Blumenthal, and I was troubled by it for a few reasons. One, because when I was watching Blumenthal, I mean, I noticed that I realized that the two of them are Jewish. Okay, what might be described as your classic Jewish, American Jewish liberal. Blumenthal was preaching to the nominee in what I felt was a very self-righteous way about things that the nominee had possibly done in high school. Now, putting aside the fact that we all, well, I shouldn't say we all, but many of us, myself included, have done crazy things in high school that I shouldn't have done. Now, we all make mistakes, but making mistakes when you're in high school, all right, teenagers are off the wall, or off the charts. But what really troubled me was that he was preaching, and the nominee was supposed to be this perfect individual who may have done some things when he was 17 years old. Okay, apparently, in the end, we found out there was nothing corroborated. But the point is that Blumenthal once claimed to be a great warrior in Vietnam, and then it was found out afterwards that he never was in Vietnam. So there was something very hypocritical, very troublesome about it. But for me, what was the most troublesome, and the most troublesome thing, when I hear all these self-righteous liberal Jews that are part of the Democratic Party, is that they're Jews. And that some of them exploit Judaism to call names. And I saw a big rally at the time Trump came out with his Muslim immigration policy. And it wasn't really a Muslim immigration policy, but it was a policy of limiting immigration from certain Muslim-dominant countries where terrorism is quite prevalent. And so I saw a big demonstration of Jews and other leftists demonstrating against the immigration policy and calling it Islamophobia, and saying that Trump is a racist and an anti-Semite and an Islamophobe, and all these other interesting terms, and it was called, the demonstration was called Jews Against Islamophobia. Now, I was watching this and I was thinking, this isn't Judaism. And then I later heard all the criticism of Stephen Miller by some Reform rabbis in America. Well, actually, before I get into that, I think I have to answer the question about who are the American Jews? Because a lot of people don't really understand, don't even know. And I'm not talking about American Jews who don't know who the American Jews are, but that's another issue. I'm talking about most other Americans. So, American Jews, for the most part, came to America in the early part of the 20th century. There were Jews living here already, but in fact, if we go all the way back to George Washington's time, one of the most prominent American Jews was a man named Chaim Solomon, who almost single-handedly financed the American Revolution. I mean, I'm talking about, tens of millions of dollars, which at that time was, I mean, even now it's an enormous amount of money, but then we're talking about billions. And he was a good friend of George Washington's. He financed the American Revolution. But there were many others. But I'm talking mainly about the main Jewish immigration, which came in the early part of the 20th century. These immigrants came here as legal immigrants. My grandparents came to the United States as legal immigrants from Eastern Europe. And I still have the boat documents to prove it. They came here because they wanted to be Americans. They wanted to work hard, and they wanted to, and they came here in poverty. I remember interviewing my grandparents and my great uncles and my great aunts. My great uncle, I asked him about how it was when he was living in Russia, in his little town in Russia. He said, we were very, very poor. Maybe we were able to have chicken once a week. Then I interviewed my great aunt. I said, we were very, very poor. We had chicken maybe twice a week. And these were two separate interviews. I didn't do it together. Just interesting that they used chicken as the guideline. But yes, they came here in poverty, and they lived in the slums in the Lower East Side and in Brooklyn, Lower East Side of Manhattan, that is, and in Brooklyn. And they worked in the sweatshops, and they worked in the factories, and they worked very hard. Eventually, they raised themselves out of it, and their response to poverty and to discrimination, and there was a lot of discrimination against the Jews at that time, the response of their parents was, you work even harder. And you work hard in school, and you're going to succeed. And you think of ideas, and you use your creativity, and become entrepreneurs, and create. Eventually, they started creating their own factories and their own businesses. And eventually, they became very successful. And today, the Jews are the most successful, materially successful religious group or ethnic group in America. But it didn't happen from days of rage. They didn't call for days of rage. They said, work hard and achieve. And it reminds me a little bit of Ben Carson, who's not Jewish, but he was kind of raised with the same values, and those are values that seem to have been forgotten in many ways in many groups in America, and that's a shame. But what can be learned from the American Jewish immigrants is enormous. And when you look at the whole immigration controversy, you realize that a merit-based immigration system makes a lot of sense. It makes sense for America. It makes sense for rightness. It's just the correct thing. So, when I see that Trump is being called all kind of names because of this immigration policy, well, that disturbs me very much. But I think to give this all proper context, I think that it's important to understand who the American presidents were before. And I'm not going to go through all of them because there have been a lot of different American presidents, but George Washington, for one. George Washington recognized the importance of Israel. So you may be thinking, but there was no Israel. That was in 1948. By the way, it is getting a bit warm in here. You don't have to turn it all the way up, but a little bit. I hope that's okay.
No, it is.
Yeah. A little bit. Anyhow, so George Washington spoke to 2 Jewish congregations, and he blessed them. He said, "I call on the divine providence to bless these United States of America and to bless your congregation. And I call on the Almighty God to bless these United States of America through this congregation." Well, it sounds a little bit to me like Genesis chapter 12, which says that those who bless Israel will be blessed. George Washington understood that. John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, all of them expressed their desire that Israel will be restored to its land once again as a sovereign nation. Harry Truman was the first world leader who recognized Israel again as a sovereign nation. President Truman was biblically connected. And because he was biblically connected, anytime he met someone from Israel, he became very emotional. He had a meeting with David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel. And Ben-Gurion, after the meeting, at the end of the meeting, he noticed that President Truman was getting very emotional. He was getting very teary-eyed. And he suggested that the president, not leave the meeting right away. It was the end of their meeting, and he told them that there's a mob of reporters outside. Maybe you shouldn't go out in this condition, being all shaken up. And President Truman, wasn't afraid of anything. He's a pretty tough guy. He wasn't afraid of the media. His campaign slogan was, "Give him hell, Harry." He was a tough guy. So he went out. He went out and he saw the media. And 5 minutes later, Ben-Gurion goes out of that room and also sees the media. And one of the reporters runs up to the prime minister and says, Mr. Prime Minister, what did the two of you discuss in there? Why was President Truman crying when he came out of the room? That was Harry Truman. And that was his connection to Israel. Israel for him was a fulfillment of prophecy. He understood that. But then things started to change some years later. I'm skipping over a lot of presidents, I know, but most of them had a heart for Israel, including LBJ, President Johnson, including Woodrow Wilson. Okay, but I'm not going through all of them. Then came Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter claimed to be a born-again Christian, and maybe he was. But he was also a born-again Christian that believed in replacement theology. He was a born-again Christian that believed that the Jews were no longer God's chosen people, that the Christians had taken their place. And his heart for Israel was affected by that. Ultimately, after he was already retired and was no longer president a long time already, then he started to partner with the Hamas terrorist organization. And then came Obama. And Obama, well, I don't want to get into Obama totally, but I wrote about it substantially in my book, The Islamic Tsunami, Israel and America in the Age of Obama. But Obama came from a Muslim father and a secular communist mother, and his policies reflected that, but his heart reflected that even more. He had much more of an affinity for the Islamic world than for Israel. And then came the elections of 2016, when there were 18 candidates on the Republican side, and it was either 17 or 18, I don't remember. I think there was 18. 18, which in the Jewish numerical equivalency represents life. And it definitely was lively. So they're standing there on this stage, all these candidates, very experienced candidates politically and otherwise. There was Governor Scott Walker and former Governor Mike Huckabee and Florida Governor Jeb Bush, who was considered the front runner at first. Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, serious people. And many others as well, but I'm not going to name them all, otherwise we'll run out of time. But these were serious people, and in the middle of them stood this crazy businessman from New York named Donald Trump. And at least that's how he was portrayed in the beginning. And he swept the field. And true, during the campaign, he acted sometimes like he was on the streets of New York. And I've said in the past, Trump, you have to remember, Trump grew up in Queens, in the borough of Queens, which is mostly you have Manhattan, which is where the upper class people live, and in our times, not when the immigrants came, everything was different then. And then you have Brooklyn and Queens. Okay, I come from Brooklyn originally. I've been in Israel 26 years, but I come from Brooklyn originally. I grew up as an atheist in Brooklyn. And eventually, for a variety of reasons, which I wrote about in my first book, God, Israel, and Shiloh, I made it back to the land of Israel and the God of Israel and Jewish people. But Trump was living in Queens, and I was living in Brooklyn. And these are the two working class boroughs. And I realized Trump wasn't working. He wasn't from a working class family. His father worked pretty hard, but he was a millionaire developer. And he had all these housing projects all over Brooklyn and Queens. But sometimes we assume that people are wealthy, that they're just pampered and spoiled. But the Trump kids weren't pampered and spoiled in any way. In fact, Donald Trump has told stories about how he used to go to construction sites with his father, and his father would walk around and he would pick up screws from the floor, and he would call over the workers and say, "What are these screws doing on the floor?" He taught Donald and his other kids the importance of hard work, the importance of not being wasteful, and the importance of working hard to achieve something, to have a vision and to achieve it. And that's what he learned from his family. Okay, so jumping ahead to the campaign again, so they had this campaign, and President Trump, he took the Republican nomination. And then he won the general election. Now, during the general election, he had two advisors who advised him about Israel. Now, I didn't mention about, I was talking a little bit about the liberal American Jews before. But I didn't tell you how it became that way. Because I said that the Jews have been the most successful financially in the United States of all the groups. But at the same time as becoming very successful financially and doing it through very hard work and creativity, the Jewish community in the United States also fled from its roots. My grandfather, for example, came from a very religious family in Europe, in Eastern Europe. But he came to the United States and he just wanted to be an American, and he dropped it all. He dropped his whole Jewish heritage. He started working on Saturday, which is the Jewish day of rest, the Jewish Sabbath. And what happened with him and his wife, my grandparents, happened with so many thousands of Jews, and the Jewish community became less and less connected to its roots and its religion. And the Reform and the Conservative movement became the dominant religious grouping in America. Now, for those of you, how many of you know what Reform and Conservative means in Judaism? Okay, you all think that you know what it means. Okay, I'm going to tell you what it means. We'll see if it's really so. Okay, so the Reform movement, I'll give you a very brief description. The Reform movement started in Germany in the mid-1800s. For about 2,000 years, the Jews were always Orthodox. Most of the Jewish communities were Orthodox communities. And when I say Orthodox communities, that means, though loosely defined, it means those that believe that Moses received the Ten Commandments from God on Mount Sinai, that the words of the Torah are true,
and that they're the Word of God. Okay, that's the Orthodox. Okay, but then the Reformists came in Germany, and they just wanted to be successful Germans. And they were becoming more and more secularized, and they wanted to fit in Germany. They wanted to be recognized as real Germans. And they changed their religious practices. They reformed the religious practices. They built their own temples, and they started to worship the Sabbath on Sunday, as the Christians did, as the other Germans did. And they started to have organs in their synagogues. And they stopped the men. You know, we have this tradition that the men wear these interesting hats that we call kippot on our heads to show that God is above us. And by the way, did you know why men have to wear them on their heads and the women don't? Because the women are on a higher spiritual level, and they don't need these reminders, these physical reminders that God is above them. You know, men historically have always been the hunters, the athletes, and you know, we're so into our physical prowess, but the women are more spiritually connected, just naturally more spiritually connected. This is something that is known in Judaism. So anyhow, so the Reformists, they said, okay, we're removing this from our heads. We'll go into the synagogue as a German will go into church. And they did that with so many things. And then there was a small portion of these Reformed Jews that said, hey, this is crazy. This is crazy. You've gone too far. You've left everything. You've destroyed your Judaism. The Reformists ridiculed this faction, and they said, you guys are so conservative, meaning you're so afraid of change. And they started to call them the conservatives, and you know what? The name stuck. Eventually, when they became established in America, they called themselves conservative Jews. And they saw themselves as a bridge between Orthodoxy and Reform. As time went on, though, the conservatives moved in the direction of the Reform, and in our times, the conservative movement and the Reform movement, of course, recognizes same-sex marriage, recognizes, a lot of the conservatives are still against intermarriage, you know, and won't officiate at an intermarriage between Jews and Gentiles. And by the way, but that's changing also. And most of the intermarriage, you should know, in America, where mostly Reform and conservative Jews, and the second fastest growing group in Judaism, the unaffiliated. Those who say they don't believe in organized religion. And that group is intermarrying in a pace of 60% in the United States at this point. And when I say they're intermarrying, they're not getting married to evangelical Christians. They're getting married mostly to Jews to non-Jews who are secular. And when that happens, so they just cease being Jews, and their children are not raised Jewish in any way. Maybe in a very, very minute percentage of them, but so basically the Jewish community in the United States is shrinking because what we're talking about is is the 90% of Jewish community that is not Orthodox, that is not strongly identified with Judaism. We're talking about the 90% that only sends their children to public school or non-sectarian private schools. Then there is that 10%. Oh, by the way, as far as that 90% of American Jewry that is fading away, assimilating and fading away, of that group, a very high percentage doesn't even get married. Maybe 50%, they don't even get married. Then you have the 10% of American Jewry that is Orthodox. And that group believes strongly in getting married and believes strongly in having children, and sometimes a lot of children. And that is by far the fastest growing group in Judaism, in America. Also in Israel. But in Israel, some interesting things are happening. That is the opposite. In Israel, the traditional family is becoming stronger. Yes, there is a very passionate gay rights movement and all that in Israel as well. And they have a march in Tel Aviv every year where where the men put on, pink dresses and they march through the streets and, all kinds of things. And they even have a march in Jerusalem, which is much more restrained. But the point is that in Israel, it doesn't matter whether you're ultra-Orthodox or modern Orthodox or traditional or even secular. In Israel, the marriage rate is growing, the birth rate is growing, and that goes across the spectrum. True, the Orthodox have a lot more kids, but it goes across the spectrum. Because in Israel, most of the Jewish population in Israel is very strongly Jewishly identified. They care about being Jewish. Whereas here, as I said, they're just fading into the much bigger culture. And not in a good way. And most of those Jews are Democrats. Because their religious philosophy and their moral philosophy doesn't come from Judaism. It comes from liberalism. The belief in unrestricted abortions and of course free abortion, but unrestricted. The belief that starting the day with a 1 minute in public schools, having a one minute of prayer, or even a moment of silence and contemplation and reflection, is somehow a terrible thing. And where I live, well, let me tell you a little bit about where I live. Okay, I'll tell you a very just to give you a little background. Okay, 26 years ago, I made Aliyah. I moved to Israel, and I moved to the biblical heartland of Israel, which a town called Shiloh. Okay, which most Americans would know as Shiloh, because I know there's 65 cities or towns in the United States called Shiloh, and there was a Civil War battle called Shiloh, and there was a Neil Diamond song called Shiloh, and there, schools and churches, and I passed the Shiloh Inn or hotel when I was on my way here today. There were Shilohs all over America, and that speaks volumes about the biblical foundations of the United States of America. But I live in the original Shiloh, the place where Joshua spoke to the Israelites and said, "How long will you wait before coming to take possession of the land that the Lord God of your fathers has given you?" And it's the same Shiloh where a woman named Hannah came to pray for a son, and the son who was born from her prayers, she named Samuel, and he grew up into prophecy in Shiloh, and he was the one who would go on to appoint the first two kings of Israel, Saul and David. David would set up the unified kingdom in Jerusalem. His son Solomon would build the holy temple in Jerusalem. From Shiloh to Jerusalem, as we say in Jewish tradition, from the resting place to the inheritance. Okay, so that's a little bit of my background. I had the privilege of being elected as mayor of Shiloh, and 1 year after that, I was wounded in a terror attack when I was coming back from Jerusalem, and Islamic terrorists ambushed our car. They shot up the car with AK-47 assault rifles. I was shot in the leg. My son was shot in the head. A bullet that went into his head and through his neck missed his brainstem by 1 millimeter. And the car wasn't starting. The car was dead as the terrorists were shooting, and I tried to start it over and over. Miraculously, suddenly the car started. I got away from the terrorists. I drove 170 kilometers an hour, which is about 110 miles an hour, to get to the next community up the road, where I hoped I could get an ambulance. And sure enough, an ambulance came. That's when they discovered that my son had been wounded. And they took us to the hospital in Jerusalem, where I was pronounced the 1,000th victim of terrorism to be hospitalized in that hospital in that previous year and a half. No, I was not given a trophy, but the fact is that they did keep records like that in the hospital. Well, we had 2 operations, each of us, and eventually we came home. About 3.5 weeks later, my son is home, and he goes walking, screaming in the middle of the night. I remember, this is a 3-year-old we're talking about. And my wife and I realized that there was deep psychological trauma in that little boy. But we had no idea how you deal with trauma in a child that young. But we started thinking about it and asking people and trying to figure it out, but we really couldn't figure it out. About 2.5 weeks later, I'm sitting in my living room, in the other corner of the living room, and my son is on the other side of the living room, and he's sitting and playing in this big toy car that we had. He's inside this big toy car. And he was in his pajamas, and he still had a big bandage on the back of his head. And I hear him talking. So I look over in his direction, and he picks up a doll that was in the driver's seat in that car, and he says to me, "This the Abba, this is the father. He has a hole in his leg." Which indeed I did, even after 2 operations and plastic surgery. And then he picks up the other doll and he says, "This the baby. He shot in head." And at that moment, I became very emotional and teary-eyed, because I realized several things. Number one, 3 things really. Number one, I realized that this was the first time that he had verbally expressed anything having to do with a terror attack, and this was almost 6 weeks after the attack. I also realized that this is how we can heal his emotional trauma. Through some form of play, therapy, role-playing. And I didn't really know, what that meant in detail, but I realized that this is what needed to be done. And really it's at that moment that I realized that this was a mission that God had planted in me. Because we have an expression in Judaism, Hakol L'Tovah. Everything is for good. Now, it doesn't mean that everything is good that happens. We know that bad things happen to good people. But when bad things happen to good people, it's really God giving us challenges and saying, okay, what are you going to do about it? And that's when I decided to start what would eventually become the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, for the purpose of healing the trauma of the terror victim children and rebuilding the biblical heartland of Israel through those children, hence restoring some of that lost innocence of childhood for these children. Well, now 14 years later, we have a magnificent therapeutic educational campus where we have two schools, a boys' school and a girls' school, where we have a formal therapy center, where we have a petting zoo and a music playground and a music studio, and these are all for informal therapy, as well as formal therapy. We also have a therapeutic horseback riding farm, about 5 minutes from there. And all of these therapies are for the over 2,000 children on that campus. And we also have regular classes there in the regular schools. Okay, but it's not, there's nothing regular about it. That was the vision that God had given me of this therapeutic educational campus that will meet the needs of the children in this time that we're living in. And they're not normal times. They are not normal times. At the time of the terrorist attack that we experienced, there were many, many other terrorist attacks, and it was almost a daily thing. And unfortunately, in our times, okay, about 14 years later, it's again starting up in a more intense way. There was a terrorist attack just 3 days ago where a couple of people were killed working in an industrial zone. A woman, a man. Then before that, there was an American Israeli who was killed in a terrorist attack. So this is something that's very serious, and we know about taking care of the physical needs. The Israeli government takes care of the physical needs of all the terror victims. But then there are those who are emotionally scarred, and sometimes we don't find out about who is really emotionally scarred until years later. And sometimes it's not even the ones who have been killed or wounded themselves in their own families. Sometimes it's not even the ones who have a friend or a teacher or a neighbor who's been killed in a terrorist attack. Everyone knows somebody, and everyone's affected. But sometimes the effects defy the expectations. For instance, one of my daughters, my eldest daughter, I believe that she has been more scarred from that terrorist attack than my son who was wounded. Okay, a lot of it has to do with personalities. A lot of it has to do with the uncertainty of not being in that terrorist attack and just building it up in your head as something that could happen to you. So thank God the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund has done tremendous things. And we do it with the help of people around the world who stand with us and donate towards the cause. Okay, so getting back a little bit to what I was saying before, that connection with Israel and that connection with the biblical heartland of Israel is a connection that the current President of the United States has. Now, whatever one thinks about President Trump, whatever one thinks about his personality or certain things that maybe they don't like, the fact is that he's very closely connected with Israel, and his foreign policy advisors, especially the ones that have to do with Israel and the Middle East, are traditional Jews who are closely connected with Israel. One of them studied in a yeshiva, which is the equivalent of a Bible college, for about a year in Judea, in the so-called West Bank. His other Middle East advisor, who is now the American ambassador in Israel, is also an Orthodox Jew who has given donations in the past to certain communities in Samaria. So these are people who are strongly identified as Jews and are closely connected with Jewish tradition. And that makes all the difference when it comes to the President of the United States, because he's being advised by people who care about their Judaism more than they care about abortion and same-sex marriage. And that's something that's unheard of. It's something that's totally new. And speaking of totally new, his policies are totally new. Instead of negotiating with Iran and supporting the Iranian nuclear deal that was designed to simply push off the problem, kick the can down the road, and so that within 10 years they will have the nuclear bomb if nothing is done about it, President Trump came in and said, we are not going to allow this, and he kept his promise, and he said, if this deal can't be changed by the European Union or by Congress to make it a better deal, then we're out. And they didn't come through for whatever reasons, either because the establishment Republicans couldn't get past, couldn't accomplish in Congress what they wanted to, or because the European Union just doesn't want to part with the financial aspect of doing business with Iran. President Trump said, that's it, we're out of the deal, we're putting on the sanctions again, and he kept his word. He also kept his word on moving the embassy, the American embassy, to Jerusalem, which no president before that, several presidents promised it. Congress passed a resolution saying that this has to be done, but no one had the courage to do it. It took a crazy New Yorker to get it done. And more recently, President Trump has given the order to close down the PLO embassy they call it, but it's really a PLO office in Washington. And the Trump administration is also examining the whole issue of Palestinian refugees, because the United Nations tells us, and by the way, I'm sorry to see Nikki Haley resign, but hopefully she will be replaced by somebody who's equally good. But the United Nations defines Palestinian refugees to the tune of 4 million, approximately, and the fact is that there were only 38, at the time of the War of Independence, Israel's War of Independence in 1948, there were only 38,000 Palestinian refugees. At that time, they didn't call themselves Palestinians. They didn't use the old Roman term that's named after the Philistines to define themselves. They were just Arab refugees who left the land of Israel during Israel's War of Independence. There were 38,000. And for every other people in the world, we define refugees as those who are forced to flee their countries. When it comes to the Palestinians, So it can be their brothers and sisters and cousins and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-nephews. Anyone who's related to them in any way is considered to be a refugee. So the Trump administration is starting to examine that a little bit and have a more honest understanding of what is a refugee. By the way, there were several 100,000 Sephardic Jews who fled the Arab countries shortly after Israel's War of Independence. They were never defined as refugees by the UN. So the game is changing. The rules of the game are changing, and it's kind of strange to see many of these liberal, secular American Jews calling Trump names, but the fact is that those who are strongly Jewishly identified understand that he is doing a very good job on several fronts. And one of those fronts is making America's policy more consistent with Judeo-Christian values. And yes, there are some differences in Jewish values and Christian values, but the fact is that the values of hard work and merit-based immigration, and by the way, Israel has a wall at the southern border separating Israel from Egypt, and President Trump has seen that wall, and and a lot of his idea of walls working on borders comes from that. And the truth is, since that wall has been, Israel had a real problem about illegal immigrants coming in from Africa and from the Egyptian border. Since that wall was built, that immigration has come to a halt. So it works. It works. And then you have certain other ideas such as ideas about security. Now, when we see all the random shooting attacks in schools and elsewhere, I am absolutely convinced that a lot of that comes from an absence of values. Right? If you take God out of the family, and you take God out of the classroom, and you destroy the traditional family and even mock the traditional family, then the values are going to go out the window, and people are going to look for their values elsewhere, or they're just going to have, they're not going to have that framework of security that keeps a person calm and confident. So I believe that a lot of those random shooting attacks come from that ultimately. But then in Israel we have practical ways of dealing with things like that. Every school in Israel has to have an armed security guard. And I believe it's so all over Israel. And if you go into a lot of schools in Israel, you'll see some of the staff in the school with weapons, with pistols on their waists. Okay, we have background checks, and that have become more stringent over time. And but if you have a license to carry, so you're allowed to carry, and even it doesn't have to be concealed. And nobody really thinks anything of it. You know, it is what it is. But it provides a safety net in case, God forbid, something happens. And there have been a lot of cases of terrorist attacks in Israel in which the terrorist is killed by an Israeli civilian who was nearby, who happened to have a weapon. And then we come to issues of, well, we discussed morality, we discussed immigration, and then of course there is the issue of standing with Israel. If the United States stops standing with Israel, the United States will cease to exist. The economy will fall apart, as was happening during the years of Obama. And even before that, you know, the economic breakdown, the economic collapse happened near the end of the Bush administration and then continued through the Obama years. President Bush, in the first part of his administration, was very pro-Israel. The second part of his administration, he started to turn against Israel and start pushing that Palestinian state thing. And that's when the American economy collapsed. Well, that's the way I see it, at least. So, when I talk about standing with Israel, well, there are several ways of standing with Israel. One way is to stand with the candidates who are pro-Israel, who really stand with Israel, who don't just say, I love Israel. I'm pro-Israel. I'm also pro-Palestinian, but I'm pro-Israel. I believe in a Palestinian state in the heartland of Israel, but I'm pro-Israel. Okay, you can't take a tiny country that's the size of New Jersey and carve out its whole central mountainous area that overlooks Israel's one international airport and hand it over to the Hamas and Fatah terrorists and say you love Israel. It's a contradiction in terms. So yes, stand with candidates and vote for candidates who stand with Israel. And vote in the midterms. And I'm not telling you how to vote, but I think the message is clear. And of course, partner directly with those who are active in the biblical heartland of Israel. And so when I talk about that, of course, I'm talking about the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, because what better way is there to partner with Israel than to partner with the children of Israel? So I have a short video I'd like to show you. About a year after my term as mayor, I was coming home from Jerusalem with my 3-year-old son sitting behind me in the baby seat. Halfway home, the car was hit by a massive hail of bullets from Islamic terrorists on the side of the road. When the bullets hit, I was shot in the leg. Blood started coming out all over the place. My son looked like he was trying to scream or to cry, but no sounds were coming out. The car wasn't starting, it was completely dead, and the terrorists were still shooting. Finally, the car started. I zoomed ahead as fast as I could to get to the next community up the road where I hoped I could get an ambulance. I had been shot in the leg. My son had been shot in the head. The bullet had gone into his head where the skull meets with the neck, causing a skull fracture. The bullet had missed his brainstem by 1 millimeter. We had weeks of treatment in the hospital, 2 operations, and what we discovered afterwards was that my son was badly in need of psychological post-trauma therapy. And that's when I decided to start the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, because I understood the mission that God had intended for me was to heal the trauma of the terror victim children and to rebuild the biblical heartland of Israel through those children.
Shiloh, the capital and spiritual center of ancient Israel. It was in Shiloh where the Ark of the Covenant resided almost 400 years.
It's an enormous, awesome privilege that I can be here and be involved and have a part in rebuilding the biblical heartland of Israel through children. I thank God every day for that privilege.
Through David Rubin's Shiloh's Fund, the quality of life for children has really grown over the years.
It's really very good for all the children here, for all the people of Shiloh, not only Shiloh but also the other places, other localities near Shiloh.
For Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, for all the fun things they do.
The area of Samaria and Shiloh in particular has suffered from a disproportionate amount of terrorist attacks. There is hardly a child in Shiloh who has not had a parent or a sibling or a family member, neighbor or a friend or a teacher who's been killed or wounded in a terrorist attack. Everyone has been traumatized to varying degrees. And for that reason, I understood that there was a need to establish a therapeutic educational complex that would heal the trauma of children. And it would be the best place to serve the needs of the children for the entire Shiloh Township and all of Samaria.
למפגש מגיעים ילדים מכל הסביבה, מאזור שילו, אלי והיישובים בסביבה, ומגיעים גם מאזור השומרון ואזור בקעת הירדן. המטרה שלנו במפגש לתת טיפול שהוא קודם כל מאוד מקצועי, ודבר שני שהוא נגיש. הוא גם קרוב פיזית וגם נגיש מבחינה כלכלית לאנשים שמגיעים לפה.
The kids who come to us for therapy, they talk so much about really like how much they're scared of the Arabs. What if an Arab comes through my window? What if I get a rock thrown at me? A lot of times they have a need to discuss it over and over again, sort of to get it out of their system and maybe feel safe in a crazy situation.
יש פה מטפלים שהם מכירים את האוכלוסייה, הם מגיעים מתוך האוכלוסייה, חלקם חוו בעצמם מקרים של טרור או של טראומות שונות, ומתוך הידע המקצועי שלהם ומתוך הניסיון האישי שלהם הם יכולים לבוא ולתת את הטיפול הכי מותאם למי שמגיע לפה.
Therapeutic horseback riding has been recognized around the world as being a very effective form of treatment for children, and therefore we've incorporated that into our program.
When a child learns to ride on a horse and he does such things that he never did, his self-confidence grows. You can see children that comes here with a body like this, they come back with their back very straight. You can see through the body how they feel inside. The confidence grew.
Ever since Shiloh was reestablished 40 years ago, there has not been a high school here. A 14-year-old boy has to go away to a full-time dormitory school. He doesn't get to see his family for sometimes weeks at a time.
Many people recognize the need and the importance of this project, but government isn't supporting us yet. In order to get the project off the ground, we got the support of the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, and that's what really helped us get started, because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to do anything.
This project is very important for me because I lost my son, and now I have the opportunity to build a high school for children here in Shiloh, and this gives us a lot of comfort for me and my family.
אנחנו פה צוות שבונים פה את הישיבה התיכונית בגוש שילה. אני נפצעתי בפיגוע לפני 7 שנים. ניסו להוציא אותנו מכאן על ידי פיגועים וטרור, אז מאוד מאוד חשוב לנו להישאר כאן, ושדור ההמשך של הילדים ושיתחנכו פה ושיהיה פה היאחזות חזקה באזור שילה.
I think it's very important that there's finally a yeshiva that's close to home and you don't have to go somewhere far. I want to say thank you for all the people who donated money to the yeshiva that don't live in the country, helping us a lot here. Thank you very much.
בזכות קרן שילה לילדי ישראל, אנחנו יכולים להגשים את החלומות של בית הספר ולהצעיד את הילדים שלומדים כאן מעלה.
יש לנו חלומות של דברים שאנחנו רוצים לעשות, וקרן שילה לילדי ישראל מאפשרת לנו, אם זה בהקמת חדר אומנות, שמאפשר לבנות לבטא את היצירתיות שלהם, את הכישרונות שלהם. אם זה בהקמה של מרחבי למידה, ללמידה אישית ופרטנית של הבנות. ובכל בקשה ובכל עזרה, אנחנו יודעים שאפשר לפנות לקרן שילה לילדי ישראל ולקבל שם את העזרה.
I welcome the support of everyone who's willing to stand with us in this struggle as we rebuild the land of Israel, we rebuild the biblical heartland of Israel, and we do it through the children, through the next generation of Israel.
Regarding PTSD. I've heard people in Israel say things like blank percent of Israelis have PTSD today. What number would you put on that across the nation? And then more specifically, what would you put on that in Judea and Samaria?
First of all, it depends on how you define PTSD. I would say, if you're talking about those who are affected or traumatized to some extent, to varying degrees, by the state of terrorism and war, I would say 100%. Most people don't want to admit it, but that's the reality, especially in Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem, because that's where it's most intense, that's where it's most focused. It doesn't mean that every single one of them can function without going through formal therapy. As I said, there are varying degrees. Yes?
Another question. I visited Shiloh, and I've been privileged to have you take Gidon, Ariel, and myself around to see some of the facilities. One of the things that impressed me was the children at school. I happened to be there at a time when they were practicing, I believe it was a song. It was basically a recitation of scripture. I can't remember where it was, but it was in the Torah. It was in the first 5 books. I'm curious how much memorization of the Bible are the children in Shiloh or in Judea and Samaria, in the Bible schools, or in the Jewish schools. How much are they getting? Because I think it's wonderful. I'm amazed at what I saw.
Well, number one, in answer to your question, the children learn Bible through song, because we want God to be not just in their heads but also in their hearts, and they do that every day. In our schools, at least, they do that every single morning, and they start their day with a half an hour of prayer, and then they go right into that usually. By the time they finish 8th grade, they have learned the entire full book, the entire 5 books of Moses.
In song?
Yeah.
Whoa.
And sometimes they know it. There too, to varying degrees, but there are actually symbols. There are symbols if you take a book of the Torah, there are symbols underneath the letters, so you know the incantation through that. So once you learn it, you know it. You can take any text and you can do it. You can sing it. Frankly, I don't know how, because I don't come from that background. you know, I came from a more secular background. I went to public schools in the United States, and so I don't know, but my children know. Yes, ma'am.
How old were you when you moved? When you?
Thank you, Ariel.
You asked how old was I when I moved to Israel? Well, I had two 2-month visits to Israel when I was 25 and 26, and then I went back to America I was back in America for about 3 years, and then I came to Israel again for about 1.5 years, and then I went back to America again for about 4.5 years, and then finally when I was 35 years old I came and I stayed, and I've been there ever since. Okay, first of all, President Trump has a gut feeling for the Jewish people. He's not an evangelical Christian, but I really believe that he has a gut feeling for the Jewish people. And sometimes when Trump has a feeling that something is right, he goes with it, and he'll go all the way with it. Okay, so let's look at a few different types of influences he has. Number one, he has a daughter who is a convert to Judaism. Okay, and his son-in-law is Jewish, and he has 3 Jewish grandchildren. And they're not just Jewish, like Chelsea Clinton's husband, who is just Jewish in name only, but they're practicing Jews. They keep the Sabbath. They turn off their television and their phones on the Sabbath. They actually do that, and as Ivanka beautifully explains it, and I quoted it in my book, Trump and the Jews, that she says, it's a time for the family to relate to each other, without the phones, without everything else, all these technological devices. It's our time to be together. Okay, so the Sabbath, we refer to the Sabbath as an island in time. That it's a time when we just focus on family, we focus on worship with God, and we have festive meals, and we discuss the various moral issues of our time and things we can learn about life from the Torah. And Trump, I think Trump understands some of that, and he also has been influenced very strongly by a lot of the pastors and evangelical Christians who've become close to him through the whole campaign and through this whole process. He's also been influenced by Ambassador Friedman and by Greenblatt, as Middle East negotiator. He's been influenced by Mike Pence, who, as we know, is a very strong evangelical Christian. And these are all people who have his ear and advise him. So, do I think that Trump moved the embassy because he strongly believes that he's going to be blessed for it? I don't know. Maybe a little bit. Maybe in his gut he feels that. But he's definitely been advised about that, and he's definitely been advised that if it's good for Israel, it's good for America. And those who stand with Israel, it's good for America. And then, of course, there is the secular side of things, or the non-religiously connected side of things, where he just says it's the right thing to do, because every country has a right to decide where its capital city is going to be. So, in short, I would tend to agree with you on this, that the blessing factor and is definitely strong, but it comes from the advice that he's been given. he's getting great advice he's got great people around him. You know, and to all the ones that I've named so far, so you can add on Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, who were both, you know, fairly recent additions to his administration, but they were good additions. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You told us why you started Shiloh, the organization, but how did you find, or did you have prior training and education? Who did you find? How did you find the wise way to treat these children? Other than your son, you've seen your son working through, you know, and play or modeling and puppets and those things. Equine therapy is wonderful, but did you find somebody that helped you learn all this, or did you know it already?
Okay, that's actually an excellent question that I don't get asked that often, actually, but it's a good question. All right, so the question is, I'll just repeat it for those who didn't hear, that she asked, I had the idea and the vision for the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, but how did I know what to do, and how did I know who to get, and how to carry it out? The truth is, I'm a school teacher by training. I'm an educator by training. I have a bachelor's and master's degree and an almost doctorate in education from Columbia University. And when I was in my 30s, I decided that I was just going to drop it. I wasn't going to finish off the dissertation. I wanted to just move to Israel already. So I did. I never completed the doctorate. I did all the coursework, just didn't do the dissertation. And but my background is in education, so it was kind of a natural in that way. But there are a lot of stories of things that happened, quite interesting. I had this vision, and I had to figure out how to carry it out and how to create a non-profit organization. So I started meeting with some of the leaders in the community, and I'll just give you one example. But so everyone was telling me, go meet with Tzippi. So I said, who's Tzippi? I said, you know, Tzippi, she's started that therapy center, and there actually was this woman named Tzippi, and she had started a therapy center 2 days a week where they were doing physical and occupational therapy with young children. And they had like these 2 or 3 rooms, and that's where they were doing it. And I went to meet with her, we arranged the meeting, and I sat down with her. And she's just sitting there smiling the whole time. And I told her about the background and how I started the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund and the vision I had of this therapeutic educational campus. And I told her about the terrorism that led to it. And she's still sitting there smiling. I said, what are you smiling about? She said, because I've been expecting you. She opened a drawer in her desk. She pulled out a booklet, and she starts showing me one page about art therapy with a description of art therapy and what it's all about. And then another page, animal-assisted therapy and all these different therapies. And I said, okay, let's get started. And I didn't have any money to do anything really, and I had just started to learn about how to raise funds, and I had only had a couple of speaking appearances, but I felt like at that point we were on the way, and eventually we added on all of those therapy programs. We got some partners. And we got the Israeli government on board, or at least a part of the Israeli government, and we built a nice, decent-sized therapy center. And the truth is, in the coming year, God willing, we're going to be building a third floor onto the therapy center because we've really run out of space. It's overflowing. There are 6 horses. The horses are all they're all quarter horses. I think people in Texas might know what that is, and they are they're specifically trained for use with young children and specifically trained for therapy. You saw the guy in the video with who was walking with the child around with the horse. Okay, well, he's the director of the horse farm. His brother was killed in a terrorist attack when he was 18 years old. His brother loved horses, and that's how he got into it. So he went back to college to train and become certified in therapeutic horseback riding. So, so he recently told me, him and his wife, the woman who was interviewed, they said one of their goals is that they want to come to Texas and visit the different places that do therapeutic horseback riding. Yeah. The liberals usually don't identify abortion with killing. I don't know, maybe if they would look at a sonogram of a baby in the 3rd or 4th month and watch it moving and seeing the body parts, and I don't know, maybe that would change things for them. But the fact is that they identify a lot more with the liberal agenda than they identify with the Holocaust, because they're not strongly identified as Jews. There are secular Jews in Israel for whom, you start talking about the Holocaust, they are going to become very emotional and very passionate, and if you start talking about the survival of Israel, they're going to become very, very emotional and very passionate. Because anyone who sends his son to the Israeli army is going to, and who has the Jewish holidays, even if he's not religious, has the Jewish holidays as his holidays, he's going to feel a little bit differently. He's going to have more of a feeling for Israel, and that doesn't mean he's going to be against abortion, though.
So is abortion as big an issue in Israel as it is here?
No, it's not, but it is an issue. You don't have unrestricted abortion like you might have here. There is someone wants to get an abortion, they have to meet with a committee in the hospital, and the doctors examine it. But in my opinion, there are far too many abortions in Israel, though. And there's an organization called Efrat, which is very active in trying to get things in perspective as far as abortions go, and they counsel women, and they're trying to reduce the number of abortions in Israel. It's just not as intense an issue as it is here. So I'll just thank you for listening to me this evening, and just say God bless you, and God bless Israel, and God bless the United States of America.